Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be going through the horoscopes for Scorpio and Scorpio rising for the entire year of 2020. Joining me today is Leisa Schaim. Hey, Leisa.
Hey, Chris.
And she's going to be helping me today to go through the next 12 months. We're going to give you an overview of the major outer planet and some of the inner planet transits that are going to be dominating the different themes during different parts of the year. And we're going to go through month by month. So these horoscopes are primarily directed towards your rising sign, especially if your rising sign is Scorpio, although you can secondarily look at them from the perspective of your sun sign, if your sun is in Scorpio, especially if you were born during the day, or your moon sign, if your natal moon is in Scorpio, especially if you're born at night. Any other preliminaries before we jump in and get started?
No, I think that's it.
All right. And thanks everybody for joining us in the live chat, since we're doing this as a live stream tonight. This is horoscope 2 out of hopefully 3 tonight. I'll see how far we can get. Thank you for joining me.
Yes.
All right, let's jump right into it. So we're going to be looking at a few different things. One of the things we're going to look at is the planetary movements poster. So this is from an illustration from a poster that I released this year, which shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year in the signs of the zodiac and how far through the zodiac they'll get by the end of the year. So this is useful for sort of illustrating and visualizing how some of the inner planets move through the signs relatively quickly unless they turn retrograde, and how some of the outer planets move through the signs very slowly and sometimes don't change sign for a decade or so. The other thing we're going to be looking at is the planetary alignments calendar, which is another poster I released, which shows dates when lunations, such as full moons and new moons, take place, when the planets will change signs, and also when the planets will make major aspects to each other or station retrograde or direct. All right, so we're looking at Scorpio rising, and we're going to start in January. So there's 3 main things that happen in January. There is Uranus stationing direct at 2 degrees of Taurus, which is in the 7th house of relationships for those with Scorpio rising. There is an eclipse, a lunar eclipse that takes place the very next day on the 10th of January in Cancer, which is the 9th house of religion and travel and education. And then finally, there's a Saturn-Pluto conjunction coming up on the 12th of January, taking place in the sign of Capricorn, where we've got a bunch of activity taking place this month in the 3rd house of communication, siblings, and short-distance travel for those with Scorpio rising. So out of all of that, take your pick. Where do you want to get started?
Maybe I'll start with the Saturn-Pluto. This is something that's been going on for a while.
Okay. Someone I heard just did like a webinar on this recently.
Yeah, I just jumped in at the last minute to a webinar about Saturn-Pluto, so that's fresh in my head.
Okay.
Yeah. So wherever Saturn and Pluto have been transiting, which for Scorpio rising people is going to be the 3rd house of short-distance travel, siblings, communication, and to some extent teaching and learning, that's already been going on for a while now. So while there is an exact Saturn-Pluto conjunction during this month, almost mid-month, it's kind of just hitting a little accentuation of something that's already been happening, particularly since 2017. Pluto's been there since 2008, and Saturn joined it at the end of 2017. So it's already been there for a good couple years, and there's just 1 year left.
Yeah, so Saturn went in December of 2017. So they're already 2/3 of the way through this transit of Saturn going through Capricorn and going through the 3rd house, which can sometimes bring some challenges or some restructuring or some obstacles surrounding either siblings or communication, short distance travel, or even education to some extent.
So for some people, there could have been more of a distance for the past couple of years with siblings. If you have any, that's one possible manifestation of Saturn there. For some other people, you might have been working on learning to communicate better or studying something that isn't necessarily a 4-year degree, but still some sort of course of study, either formal or informal. So this is a little peak in that. It's not over yet, but you may notice it a bit more at that time.
Yeah, there's sort of an intensification of that transit, especially potentially for people that have Saturn at 22 or have placements at 22 degrees of the cardinal signs, especially 22 degrees of Capricorn, or really any of the other 3 cardinal signs, 22 Libra, 22 Aries, or 22 blank.
Cancer.
Cancer. That's the other cardinal sign. Everyone always forgets Cancer.
Yeah, poor Cancers. So, and speaking of Cancer, that's the other one where there's activity right in that 3-day time period, because there's a Cancer eclipse within 48 hours of that as well. And so for everyone, there's been a lot of activity with regard to the Cancer and Capricorn areas of your chart. And for Scorpio rising, that means a lot with teaching and learning. I mean, it's not necessarily only with that for you, but that's a main activity that crosses both the 3rd and 9th house themes. So anything that you may, these bounce back and forth every 6 months. So anything that you've been focused on for the past year or so with regard to either teaching or learning, it could also be, since it's happening in the 9th house for you in particular, something having to do with a culmination regarding any sort of travel plans, anything having to do with big picture worldviews, religion, philosophy, astrology itself goes there, even political views can. So there may have been changes with regard to that area of your life over the past year or so, and this is another new wrinkle in that story.
Yeah, so since this is a lunar eclipse that's taking place in the 9th house, it seems to imply almost like a maturation of something that you know, and of deepening of your wisdom in terms of your personal philosophy of life, or something that you've been learning or educating yourself on lately, especially over the past 6 months. But we've also had recently, just before this month, so it still kind of counts because we're in eclipse season, there was a solar eclipse in Capricorn, which is sort of like initiating a new phase of activity for 6 months in building something new with respect to your communication and the way that you communicate that which you know, which is from the 9th house. So we've got both 9th house and 3rd house things going on, as you said. But one of the things that's nice this year is, even though we're, a year and a half into the eclipses taking place in Capricorn, and we're 2 years into Saturn transiting through that sign, and the sort of restructuring that's happening as a result of that, that can sometimes be a little bit taxing or a little bit tiring or a little bit burdensome. Jupiter is just ingressed into Capricorn only like a month or two ago, and it's going to spend the entirety of 2020 in that sign, kind of balancing out some of the more heavy transits that are going on in Capricorn, and leading to a little bit more of a sense of optimism and lightness and expansion to balance out the sort of contraction that's been happening with Saturn for the past 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So it does lighten up a bit potentially, or at least some opportunity can be added to the effort that you're already putting in that area of your life. And I want to throw in my favorite 3rd house topic of cars, just because everyone I've been talking with for the past year and a half with Scorpio rising has been replacing their cars, which is a really common but mundane expression of the 3rd house, kind of how you get around in short distance travel, how you get around town, basically.
Right.
So if you haven't replaced your car yet, that might happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see what else is going on this month. We also have the Uranus station in Taurus. So we're about a year into Uranus's full-on transit through Taurus. And it really started, though, almost a couple of years ago now, right?
It was mid-May 2018 was the first ingress.
Okay. So this is moving into, or has moved into, the 7th house for those with Scorpio rising, the place of relationships, partnership, marriage, and just other people in general. So Uranus can sometimes bring major changes, sometimes destabilization or upsets, but also innovation and like new activities, and sometimes even excitement when it comes to 7th house affairs.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Yeah, so Uranus is kind of the planet of the unexpected. And so sometimes if you have Scorpio rising, this is a 7-year transit. So we're just a little bit into it. There's still a bunch of years left. It's only going to get to about 11 degrees, almost 11 degrees of Taurus this year.
10 degrees.
10:41.
Okay. Almost.
Almost 11.
We're both right.
Yeah, we're both right.
Okay.
So anyway, it's only getting to about a third of the way through Taurus, so still got a bunch of years in this transit. So what that often brings is sort of unexpected ups and downs. It can be unexpected change. It can be innovations, like you said, excitement. And those things, with regard to your personal partnership, is probably the most, common thing that it hits. But for some people, it can also, or alternately be like a business partnership, like you meet someone you start doing work with one-on-one more regularly. I have seen that happen with Uranus transits of the 7th. I've also seen something change with regard to if you are in the type of work where you do a lot of one-on-one interactions. That can be anything from customer service to client work. Anyone who sees clients like doctors or even astrologers and, just lots of one-on-one things, then that can bring erraticness to that area of your life as well.
Okay. So there's going to be two really important turning points for that this year. One of them is happening right here in January when Uranus stations direct at 2 degrees of Taurus. So that's going to be especially important for those of you that have any planets at 2 degrees of fixed signs, especially 2 degrees of Taurus, but also to a lesser extent 2 Scorpio, 2 Leo, or 2 Aquarius. And then there's going to be one other Uranus station later in the year at 10 degrees of Taurus, which is going to be important because that's going to be the first time Uranus makes it that far into this sign. And this is a long-term transit, so it's going to be having an impact. And for some of you, is going to be building up for quite a while. If you have things in the later part of the fixed signs, like the later part of Taurus, for example, or if your ascendant is very late in the sign. But still, for those of you that have things around mid-Taurus or early Taurus, a lot of the major action will start taking place with respect to that transit probably this year.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we'll come back to that later when we talk about and identify the month where the second Uranus station happens much later in the year. All right, so I think that's it for January. Let's move on to February.
Okay.
All right, so the main thing that happens in February, there's really just two main things, and weirdly, they both happen the same day. One of them is that the planet Mars leaves Sagittarius and moves out of your second house of finances, where it's been transiting since the beginning of January, which can sometimes be a period where you're expending more energy for financial matters, or other times there can be conflicts or tensions surrounding financial matters. So it's departing from that sector of your chart, and Mars is moving into Capricorn, where it's joining all of those other planets in your third house of siblings and education and communication and short distance travel. Weirdly, right around the same time, Mercury is stationing retrograde in Pisces on the same day, on the 16th of February. So that's happening in your fifth house of children, creativity, sexuality, and other matters related to that. So there's a possible overlap there, just because both of those things are happening on the same day, although since they're happening in different parts of your chart, they could also just be happening in parallel.
Mm-hmm.
So Mars moving into Capricorn and joining the party in the third house. How do you feel about that?
I feel great about that.
Okay.
Well, it's just a lot of activity in one area of your life. And for you, that's going to be that third house we were mentioning earlier, so teaching and learning and short distance travel and siblings. So if you've had any issues with siblings or even neighbors, that's another third house topic, then Mars joining the Capricorn party there could put potential extra stress or attention on that issue for you temporarily. Now, Mars is a much quicker transit most of the time than Saturn and Pluto and Jupiter, certainly. So this is a short-term additional influence. But given that we'll have both Mars and Saturn there, and Mars is the more challenging planet if you were born during the day, Saturn is the more challenging one if you're born at night. So either way, no matter when you were born, you're going to have one of the challenging planets transiting through that area. So it could indicate increased tensions with regard to either any of those people that land in the third house, relatives, siblings, neighbors, or any of those other concrete topics.
Yeah, for the people with night charts, I would expect this to just be a period where you're just putting extra energy into some of these topics, and maybe you could overextend yourself, or it could be kind of a trying time where you could overexhaust yourself or something due to having greater interactions, or having to communicate more, or travel more, or interact with your siblings more, or go through educational pursuits more, but maybe not necessarily a big deal. For people with day charts, it might be a little bit more tricky though, because Mars transits can tend to bring out more scenarios pertaining to separations or strife or just general irritation.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be a period in which you feel more irritable and more combative verbally, or in which arguments take place. There could be tensions involving your siblings or other extended relatives, like you said. but also just being careful even for things like short distance travel and like not putting yourself in a bad situation by like speeding or something when you're driving, just because a Mars transit through the third house could be easily something like getting in an accident if you had some sort of predisposition or if you were being reckless during that time.
Definitely. And don't flip off other drivers. That's my big thing about the third house.
Okay. Don't
Right?
flip off other drivers.
Yeah. Well, you never know, with road rage these days. So Mars going through the third could be a time when you feel more irritable when you're like driving around town, but like you could also get into conflict more easily. Yeah.
Okay. That sounds good. So that transit of Mars, at least, it's beginning on the 16th of February, but that's going to be going on for more than a month until late March. So that's kind of the time frame there. The periods in which it might be more important or less important for you are going to depend on what planets you have natally in either Capricorn or other cardinal signs that it could aspect while it's transiting through that sign. The other thing is the Mercury retrograde, which is starting the same day on the 16th of February in their fifth house. One of the things that's a little tricky about this one, just like the Mercury retrograde in Pisces around this time of the year last year, is that it's actually closely conjunct Neptune. So that's a little bit problematic because it increases the already natural propensity for Mercury retrogrades to be about miscommunication or just crossed wires that lead to communication from one party or another not being clear and leading to misunderstandings. So because it's happening in the fifth house of children, creative expression, and also sexuality, those are the three primary areas where it could have some relevance for you in your life. If there was if you have children, there could be a misunderstanding with your children or a misunderstanding surrounding that. What are some other possible scenarios?
I mean, those are the main concrete ones I can think of. There's some ones that are going to be one-off for some people, like having a miscommunication while going out and having fun, because the fifth house is things you do for fun.
Yeah, and also like hobbies and stuff. So having like a miscommunication involving a hobby. So this is a 3-week period. And one of the things that's interesting about it actually is that Mercury starts its retrograde in Pisces on the 16th of February, but it actually retrogrades back into Aquarius and moves into your fourth house by the 4th of March, which is the sector of the chart that has to do with the home and the family, the private life, but also sometimes the parents. So it's going to start its retrograde in the fifth house of children, but move back into the fourth house of parents. And so for some people, that might connect those two topics in your life and force you to go back and review or renegotiate or just reassess the relationship between those two areas in some way, so that something that you thought was finished previously has to be looked at again and sort of figured out anew. One of the things that's interesting about that retrograde in early March, when it goes back into Aquarius, into your fourth house, is that it stations direct there on the 9th of March, and then begins moving forward again in Aquarius. But this kind of cues up or prepares the way or paves the way for some other major transits in the same house that begin later that month in March, where on the 21st of March, Saturn moves into Aquarius, into your fourth house. And then just a week later, Mars actually also completes its transit through Capricorn and moves into Aquarius, also into your fourth house, where those two planets, Mars and Saturn, quickly form a conjunction in the first degree of that sign. So that's a little tricky because it means we've got a Mercury retrograde there first in the fourth house. So there could be some miscommunication or some things that are up for review surrounding your home and living situation, or potentially parents or family or private life. And that has to get worked out during the course of that Mercury retrograde. But then at the end of the month, we have this major shift where both of the more challenging planets move into the same sector of the chart.
Yeah, so it's almost like that Mercury direct station earlier in March kind of tips off your attention to that area of your life for some reason, but probably not the same reason as later in the month, because later in the month when Mars and Saturn go in there, that's when it's more like, oh, there's something that needs attention here for real. Like there's a problem or there's an issue of some sort with regard to either your family or, where you live, or something about your house needs repair, or, things like this. But Mars and Saturn both being there, I would expect would be more of a problem has cropped up in your home life.
Yeah, so for Saturn, this is going to be a preview of a longer term transit, because Saturn just kind of dips its toe into that sign for like 3 months. It moves in here at the end of March, and then what happens is it stations retrograde later on in May, and then retrogrades out of that sign and leaves and goes back into Capricorn in early July. So this is just a preview then for like a few months of Saturn moving into your fourth house. Then it's going to come back to Capricorn for the entire second half of the year to finish up and sort of sweep up the rest of the dust and debris from that transit. And then at the very end of the year in December, late December of 2020, Saturn will return back to Aquarius, and it'll stay in that sign for a couple of years, which is the onset of a much more long-term transit where it'll just be moving back and forth in that sector of your chart for quite a while. So that means that starting 21st of March, we're seeing a preview of a major long-term transit. So for some people, it's going to be more constructive, and it may just have to do with restructuring things in terms of your home, your family life, and your private life in general. So maybe there's some things that have been you've let sort of go by, or there's some things that are in disrepair, like you said, that sort of have to be addressed, either very literally, sometimes people have that, or sometimes more metaphorically, involving your private life. Sometimes it's things going on with your parents, or even your relationship with your parents, and needing to reassess and restructure that. For other people, there might be a longer term series of setbacks or difficulties in this area that, especially this preview period, should trigger or should set off in some significant way, so that you see a sort of series of events that's going to take a while to clean up over the course of the next 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's especially the case right at the beginning of this transit, because of that conjunction of Mars and Saturn, as soon as both of them change signs. So that whether you have like a day chart or a night chart, everybody with Scorpio rising is going to be getting that conjunction right in their first house immediately upon both of those planets ingressing. So here's the conjunction. It happens around March 30th, March 31st, around 0 degrees of Aquarius. Of course, if you have early degrees of fixed signs, that's going to be more important for you, like 0 degrees of Aquarius, 0 Taurus, 0 Leo, or 0 Scorpio. But it means whether you have a day chart or a night chart, there's just the potential for some challenging event or some major obstacle to arise at this point, especially in the first month or so of that transit, while both Saturn and Mars are moving through that sign.
Mm-hmm.
So Saturn moves in on the 21st of March, Mars on the 30th, and then Mars doesn't depart from that sign until the 13th of May.
Yeah, July 1st, I think. Oh, so sorry, you said Mars.
Yeah.
Sorry, I meant Saturn.
Okay.
So yeah, and now if something crops up, which it probably will to some degree for most Scorpio rising people with regard to your home life or something with your parents, you need to attend to it. But I don't want people to worry too much about this being a preview of this longer transit, because when you get the longer transit later on, Jupiter is actually going to swap out with Mars, and it's going to be a bit better. So even if, I don't want to scare people, if something kind of rough comes up at this time, it's not necessarily going to feel that way the entire time when you have Saturn come back later in the year.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we didn't have that with Saturn going into Capricorn at first, where we just had like 2 years of Saturn grinding through Capricorn and grinding through the third house. And it wasn't until the last third of that this year that Jupiter showed up and started balancing things out.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas while we have this 3-month period of Saturn initially dipping into Aquarius and then retrograding out, by the time it fully goes into Aquarius in late December, it moves in almost simultaneously with Jupiter for the first year of that transit.
Yeah, so we'll get there at the end of the year, but it won't be the same exact experience later on.
Good point. All right. So that's the last major thing that's happening in March, is just the onset of that transit of both Saturn and Mars into Aquarius. Then we move into April. April sees the conjunction of Jupiter and Pluto towards the beginning of the month. And one of the things that's interesting is that now that both Mars and Saturn have departed from Capricorn, that pretty much just leaves Jupiter and Pluto to their own devices in your third house for a few months, basically. So it's just Jupiter sort of unleashed and able to manifest some of those powers of like growth and expansion and stabilization in your third house. But since it's also conjoining Pluto at the same time, there might be a tendency a little bit to go a little bit overboard and maybe go too far in trying to expand in the third house, so that trying to caution and trying to have some discipline might still be called for or might still be necessary.
Yeah, though Pluto is a long-term transit, like we were talking about earlier, so it's been sort of gradually transforming something about third house matters for you. Is the way you communicate, or something about deepening your focus or deepening your thinking about a certain topic or things like that. So that's just continuing, but Jupiter's kind of like joining Pluto to amp that up, whether that's still sort of in the destruction phase for you in terms of wiping out something, your previous thought process or way of communicating or things like that, or even a relationship with a relative or sibling, or whether you are now into the sort of empowerment and building sort of building to a higher level than you have been before in any of those areas of your life.
Right.
Because that's what Jupiter and Pluto do together. It's like an amped up expansion power.
Sure. Yeah. So that exact conjunction is taking place. I think it's the first of like 2 or 3, or probably 3 conjunctions on the 4th of April. And the only other major thing is that Pluto stations retrograde later in the month on the 25th, which is just a further intensification and emphasis on the same conjunction, more or less, at that point. So that's the only major outer planet thing happening in April. Of course, Saturn and Mars are still working their way through Aquarius and through the 4th house, so that's still working in the background. Then we move into May, and what happens in May is that Saturn stations retrograde in Aquarius on the 11th of May, and there's an intensification of whatever it's trying to do and whatever it's trying to indicate as it transits through your 4th house. This is going to be one of those pivotal moments where, whether the events are internal or external, you would probably really start to feel what that transit is about and get the clearest idea of what that 3-year transit is going to result in your life during this time. Interestingly, it's only 2 days later that Mars exits that sign and moves into Pisces. So it completes that transit through your 4th house around the same time and moves into your 5th house of children, creativity, hobbies and pursuits, as well as sexuality. Simultaneously, we have Venus stationing retrograde in Gemini, which is your 8th house of shared resources, mortality, and other people's money. And Jupiter, the very next day on the 14th of May, is stationing retrograde in Capricorn in your 3rd house. So there's kind of a lot that all gets packed into that. What is it, the 2nd week of May, basically?
Yeah, there's a lot packed in, but it's kind of a jumble of like assorted different things, different energies, different areas of your life being focused upon. The Venus retrograde happening in your 8th house any retrograde brings a revisiting of whatever topic it's happening with. So this may be a revisiting or a restructuring of some sort of financial arrangement you have with a partner, anything around shared resources that you may have at home. It could also be revisiting things that involve the other financial topics besides income, such as taxes, loans, debts, and so forth. Things with mortgages, all of that. Mortgages may be, true for some people, given the activity in your 4th house of home. Certainly not everyone. But that could be one tie-in between the 4th and 8th, or inheritance. The Venus retrograde, though, this year is happening. It's stationing retrograde exactly square Neptune. And so that's something to watch out for, because while a retrograde through your 8th house could have you kind of poring over numbers or, revisiting things that you normally want to be pretty like cut and dried and factual, it's going to be exactly square Neptune, and that might fuzzify things in a way that, you might not understand until after the retrograde.
Right. I think the YouTube captioning is going to have problems with the word fuzzify.
I think it's a fine word.
Okay, we'll see. That'll be a good test. See how advanced Google's algorithm is. Nebulousness. That's another word I've been using over and over again for this Neptune transit through the 5th house, but especially that Venus retrograde square, where Venus stations in your 8th house of shared resources. As we can see there at about 21 degrees of Gemini, and it's squaring Neptune at 20 degrees of Pisces in your fifth house
Mhm.
of children and sexuality and other things like that. So there could be some crossover between those topics that is unique to this Venus retrograde. Although this Venus retrograde, one of the tricks for any Venus retrograde is to look back in 8-year increments, because the last time Venus went retrograde in Gemini was in 2012.
Mhm.
So looking back and seeing if there were any eighth house type themes that came up in your life involving either mortality or shared resources or other people's money in general could give you some preview of what this Venus retrograde period in the same house is going to look like,
Mhm.
or go back 8 years before that to 2004 and so on and so forth, depending on how old you are.
Right. And, if you do have like children that are old enough to be dealing with financial topics, that could be a tie-in. I mean, any of those fifth house topics could be, but sort of a more, easy logical one is, dealing with like shared resources involving your adult children, or dealing with, writing up wills and, how that affects your kids and things like that. That's not going to be true for everyone, of course, but that is one sort of obvious connection for some people with Scorpio rising.
Yeah. And also, like child support could be a manifestation of a connection between the eighth house of like your partner's or former partner's resources and the fifth house of children.
Yeah.
Venus going retrograde is slowing down and forcing you to pay more attention to that area, and maybe even revise something that was established previously, especially like an agreement between two people is a very Venusian type thing.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some possible manifestations of that.
Mm-hmm. And while you're revising those things, I would say, just because it's stationing square Neptune, normally I would say this more about Mercury retrogrades, but since it's involving like an area of your life you normally want to be pretty factual about, like, your finances, you probably want to wait, and if you have the leeway to, until after Venus goes direct to kind of complete whatever you're doing in that financial area, just to make sure that you have everything straight and that Neptune hasn't been sort of like, putting wool over your eyes, or even that you just didn't see something through no fault of anyone's.
Right. All right. So, and then we have the Jupiter station, but that's just an intensification of some of that third house transit that we've already talked about in previous months with respect to communication and siblings, or even travel.
Mm-hmm.
So that takes us into June. The Venus retrograde hits its halfway point through the cycle when it conjoins the sun on the 3rd of June. So it's halfway over at that point, although it doesn't actually station direct and complete the retrograde until the 25th of June, so towards the end of the month. Before we get there, there's three actually important things. One of them is there's a lunar eclipse, which takes place in Sagittarius, which is your second house of finances and personal possessions and resources. So there's some sort of culmination of events or some sort of spotlight that is shed on your second house of financial matters. So this could indicate some sort of culmination of events with respect to finances, where they become more important and more of the focus than they have in other times in your life. I think this is the first eclipse in Sagittarius, right?
Yeah, it is. This is kind of nestled into what is otherwise the Cancer-Capricorn series that will finish after this summer. And then the Gemini-Sagittarius polarity of eclipses will start in full at the end of 2020 for about a year and a half. So this is the very first one in that series. So it kind of introduces a new theme, even though that definitely also ties into that Venus retrograde in the 8th house of shared resources we were just talking about. There's a new emphasis on the financial parts of your chart, the second house of your own income and possessions, and the 8th house of shared resources.
Right. So this is one of the first previews of a real shift, because the nodes move into Sagittarius and Gemini by this time, or around this time, and it cues up a series of eclipses that will take place 6 months from now. So this first eclipse in that axis is probably going to open up a series of events that will grow and develop and mature between now and December, and then it'll really get going in December once we have the first full set of eclipses on that second house axis of your finances versus the 8th house placement of other people's finances. Okay. So that's good. That happens really early in the month on the 5th. Then a couple of weeks later, we have our second Mercury retrograde of the year. This time, Mercury is stationing retrograde in Cancer, in your 9th whole sign house, which is the place of education, philosophy, and travel. as well as like foreign places and foreign people. Mercury stations retrograde in Cancer and retrogrades all the way back to the early part of that sign, before eventually stationing direct 3 weeks later, like it always does, because Mercury retrogrades are always 3 weeks long, and it eventually stations direct in Cancer on the 12th of July.
Yeah, so, and this will happen also around the eclipse in Cancer, which I think will be the last Cancer eclipse. So this is kind of ending a whole series. It's sort of temporarily putting more attention, very temporarily, on the ninth house of, foreign travel and religion, philosophy, higher education, any of those topics. But this is kind of the last hit before the eclipses move on, certainly. So there may be another culmination here, another kind of temporary new start that's like a 6-month start. But at the same time, there's a revisiting, or there's a, going back over something you already decided, perhaps, in one of those topics, in one of those ninth house topics, because of the retrograde kind of coinciding with the eclipse. But then after this, there'll be less attention after a while on this area.
Yeah, it seems like a revisiting and sort of rethinking of something in terms of your ninth house and your personal philosophy, but also during the middle and during the process of that review of what you think and what you believe about the world, laying a new foundation and planting some seeds that will grow and develop over the course of the next 6 months in that area due to the final eclipse in Cancer, that will then grow and turn into something over the course of the next 6 months that should be more solid and more permanent as a part of your life. But it's interesting that the initial trigger is a Mercury retrograde, so there's some sort of theme of having to go back and reassess things in that area of your life first.
And that's not a bad thing to do anyway, because this is an area that's been experiencing eclipses for the past year or so. So, it's not bad to think back on, like, how has this area been? How has it changed for me over the past year and a half? In any of those areas, have I experienced other cultures more, even if I haven't traveled myself? Have I traveled more than usual, and that was like an expanding experience for me? Have I gone back to school, or even just taken a shorter course of study, things like that? So it's good to think back to that, and then you'll have one last little activation of that with the eclipse before we move on.
Yeah, and one of the things about Mercury retrogrades, sometimes they can be kind of frustrating, or it can force you to redo something or revisit something, which can be annoying, frankly. But sometimes the process of doing that, even if you have to redo something that you thought that you had finished, can be constructive. And the second time you do it, because you've already done it once, you do it better the second time than you did in the initial first pass. So just keep that in mind if you go through a frustrating period during this time, because it may end up helping you in the long term in a way that's not immediately evident, because that's a very common theme with solar eclipses, is starting something that begins very subtly, but then grows and develops and turns into something much larger and much more significant in the long term than you ever imagined that it would in the initial moments. All right, so we've got that. We've got the Neptune station. It's not really a big deal. The last major transit that's happening at the end of June is we have Mars ingressing into Aries. And normally this would just be a quick little jaunt of Mars through its home sign. But this ingress is much more important than normal, because Mars is getting ready to station retrograde, and it'll move into Aries, and it'll be moving through that sign normally. But then what will happen is it will slow down over the course of the next few months until it eventually stations retrograde at the very end of Aries, and then begins moving backwards for several weeks before eventually stationing direct. And the end result of all of this is that Mars, from this point forward, as soon as it moves into Aries on the 27th of June, will then spend the entire rest of 2020 in the same sign of the zodiac, which is Aries, and going through or transiting through the same house in your chart, which is the 6th house. So the 6th house traditionally has to do with things like work and health as the two primary things. It can sometimes be a challenging house that pertains to things like illness or accidents or injuries, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be worst case scenario type things, but other times it can just be putting greater emphasis and greater energy towards either your work or towards your health in order to maintain some like overall daily balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Mars is going to be there for a good 6 months instead of 6 weeks. So there's going to be just a lot more attention paid to sixth house matters. So whether you're working on like finding a job or doing something at your workplace that requires more energy than usual, maybe you're having to work longer hours than you normally do, whether you either work for yourself or an external job. That's pretty common when Mars is going through the sixth house. You do want to watch out for, being more careful in terms of not injuring yourself or things like that, where there may be some sort of health matter you need to attend to. This is a more important transit for both Aries rising and Scorpio rising people because Mars rules your ascendant. So, it's a more important transiting planet for you already. And then when it retrogrades, it's going to be for both of those rising signs retrograding back through a potentially health-related house. Although health won't be the major topic for everyone with Scorpio rising, but it could be. And I would say with Mars, it's not retrograde yet. So you want to, just kind of get ready for it, but it's not actually retrograde until September. But you want to pace yourself because Mars going through your sixth house is going to make you feel like you need to do all the things. The sixth house is like what you need to do during a day, whether that's, work at home or work at a job or whatever. And so it's going to just have more work on your plate, but eventually less energy to deal with it. So you want to pace yourself and not act like you need to do it all in one day because it's going to be a 6-month transit.
Yeah, this is going to be not a sprint, but more of a marathon getting through a 6-month transit of Mars, and being able to have some level of like endurance is going to be necessary to cultivate, even though that may be like the last thing that you initially want to do is just, you want to just get it done and sprint to the end of the finish line. But the problem with the Mars retrograde is there's going to be some potentially unexpected like detours along the way that's going to force you to go in a much more circuitous route than you might want to initially or think is appropriate.
Definitely. So yeah, once that enters, sort of be mindful of the work on your plate, but also try to take action, not just to get the stuff done, but to do it smartly so that you're not wearing yourself out too quickly.
Sure. So that's one of the potential health issues, is just overextending yourself and getting fatigued and expending all of one's energy during the course of this long transit. Okay. All right. Other potential issues are just like irritability in the workplace, getting into conflicts in the workplace, or potentially if you're the owner of a business with people that you're in charge of, people that are your subordinates or your employees, because the sixth house also represents employees or subordinates. Pets. Sixth house is also pets. Somebody in a previous one.
Yeah, I forget sometimes to mention that one. Yeah,
somebody was having like a Saturn transit. I forget what rising sign it was, but they were talking about Saturn transits through their sixth and having issues with like pets over the past couple of years.
Yeah. So I mean, it sounds almost like silly, but I mean, it works. Like your pet could be more irritable, or they could have health issues. Like you could need to take your pet to the vet during this transit.
Right.
Yeah.
Pet having a bad hair day for 6 months.
Well, no, I'm thinking if you have a day chart, like it could actually be more like impactful.
Yeah. One of the things, I don't want to get too ahead of us, but one of the things that's going to be important about this transit is it's going to be squaring the third house Capricorn planets. And there's going to be a few really important turning points, especially around the time when Mars stations retrograde, where it's going to be squaring Saturn and maybe creating some connection between the third house and the sixth house.
Yeah.
So we'll put that off for a month before getting there.
Okay.
All right. We are now at the halfway point. We've made it halfway through the year.
Perfect.
We're going to keep going here. We've got a lot of good comments coming through in the live chat. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate you all for joining us today. I guess there's 80 people in the live chat.
Nice.
So thanks for joining us. Everybody, if you're enjoying this, please give us a thumbs up on this video to help other people see it. And let's jump into the second half of 2020.
Okay.
All right. So July.
Yeah. So we start July right off on July 1st, Saturn retrograding back into Capricorn, into your third house of siblings and short distance travel and communications. So there may be a feeling of you were kind of done with that area, especially after Mars and then Saturn both left that to go into your fourth house of home and family. But now there's a sense of, I actually wasn't done with that. I need to finish that up. And Saturn will be back into Capricorn, into your third house for the rest of the year until partway through December.
Yeah, so good news is that there's a temporary alleviation of the fourth house transits with respect to your home and living situation and parents.
Hmm.
That kind of goes away suddenly, somewhat suddenly for a little while when Saturn leaves that sign and moves back into Capricorn. Uh, Somewhat not so good news is that Saturn is back to the final phases of whatever that transit has been about for you for the past 2.5 years now, of Saturn going through Capricorn and going through your third house of siblings and communication and short distance travel and other matters like that.
Hmm.
So the final phases of thinking you're kind of done with something, and there's probably been it's been like a breath of fresh air in that house for the past 3 months up to this point, because Saturn and Mars got out of there and just left Jupiter there all on its own.
Hmm.
So there's been a greater sense of like optimism and expansion. But then suddenly Saturn comes back into this house for one final pass. And for a lot of you, if you have planets in the earlier degrees of Capricorn or other cardinal signs, the most intense phase of this transit is probably over. So most of you don't have to worry about it too much. But if you have things in late cardinal signs, like late Capricorn, then some of that intensity could come back for one final pass.
Hmm. Definitely. But this isn't a new area. This is basically just finishing it up. So, also, even if you do feel like a renewed heaviness or a renewed, like, oh, I have to pay attention to this again, don't worry at this point. That is what I like to point out about the timing of transits. Don't worry, because this is the end. This is just basically till mid-December, and then you're done.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's the last 5 or 6 months of this, and sometimes that's really just taking a broom and like cleaning up the pieces of whatever you've already been addressing in this house for the past 2.5 years now.
Hmm. Yeah, it can be just that finishing up. For some people, maybe you've been doing more prep work this whole time, and then it's finally pulling the trigger on like whatever projects you're doing in that area or something like that.
Right.
But either way, this is not anything new you're grappling with, and you're almost done.
Okay. So it's not just Saturn returning to that sign, but we also have a lunation there.
Yeah, I think that's the last Capricorn eclipse, right?
Yeah, let me just pull that up really quickly to make sure, because I think we were having debates about some of these eclipses because they were like kind of far from the nodes, but I think
Right.
they're close enough to count.
Yeah, when they get this summer, in the summer of 2020, because of the nodes changing signs, all of the eclipses get kind of wide away from the nodes. And so, yeah, we were kind of debating all of this, each one. But I think that one counts. It's
Yeah.
just wide.
Yeah, so here it is. So it's a lunar eclipse that takes place in the sign of Capricorn.
Yeah.
So that's just re-emphasizing some of the Capricorn stuff, weirdly. And since it's a lunar eclipse or a full moon, it's representing a culmination or a maturation of the sequence of events and things that have been initiated in that sign over the course of the past year and a half that the eclipses have been taking place there, but even more broadly, the past 2.5 years that Saturn's been transiting through that sign.
Hmm.
So it's really just re-emphasizing some of the notions we were already talking about of Saturn returning to that sign, making the final pass, and maybe the final push or culmination after a long series of like building up things in that area of your life over the past couple of years.
Yeah, so basically just echoing all the same things we were saying about the last bit of Saturn's transit. This is the last Capricorn eclipse of that whole series. And then we're going to switch entirely to Sagittarius and Gemini at the end of the year. So basically, even if there is more activation in this area, it's kind of one last bit. It's not going to keep being activated over and over after this point.
Yeah, and one of the things is probably just reaching a new level of being able to communicate that which you know, because of the bouncing back and forth between eclipses in the ninth house of wisdom and knowledge versus the third house of how you communicate it. And since this is the final in the entire series, there's probably some new level that you've reached at this point in terms of communicating things that you'll start to see the results of, and you'll start to realize how far you've come in terms of that over the past couple of years, over the course of the next 6 months after this eclipse, since that's the effect or the time window that eclipses usually have.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that happens right at the beginning of the month, but is basically in effect for the rest of the month. And those are the two major things that are happening in July.
Yeah.
The two main signatures for July. Once we get to August, there's not a lot, even though it looks like there's a lot. This is mainly interplanet transits that we don't really have to address here. Stations retrograde at 10 degrees of Taurus on the 15th of August. So this is the furthest that Uranus has actually gotten into Taurus since it moved into that sign over the course of the past couple of years. So it's pretty notable, especially if you have any planets at around 10 degrees of the fixed signs, especially 10 degrees of Taurus.
So this reactivates all the same things we were talking about back in January. This is the second out of the 2 stations that Uranus will make this year. So it gets the farthest, as you just said, in terms of degree through the sign. It also stations retrograde to go back over the degrees it's already covered since January. So if you have any planets in between 2.5 and like 10.5, then it'll start going back towards those again after mid-August. But basically, we're focusing on the station here for mid-August because that imprints, a good, I would say, maybe a couple weeks with that kind of energy.
Yeah, there's probably an orb of a couple of weeks at least.
So
because it's basically, once it slows down in the stationary, it's basically in that degree for that long, at least a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And it's certainly within a degree of that for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, so this intensifies again that potential manifestations regarding unexpectedness, change, innovation, and so forth with regard to your partnership or major one-on-one interactions.
Right. Or sometimes just uniqueness or like weirdness, like the importing of weirdness into your life, either in the sphere of partnership or through whoever you're partnered up with at that time.
That's true. People often talk about transits through their 7th house and meeting people with those kind of signatures.
Yeah, that either have a Uranian signature in their own birth chart or who maybe have that going on in their own chart in some ways, so that there's something Uranian going on in this other person's life who comes into your life or in your partner's life at that time. And somehow they're the one that brings in this element of, in some instances, like instability or chaos, or in other instances, like excitement and unpredictability in a positive way.
Yeah, and it can be unexpectedness and instability sometimes, like your partner's acting more erratic than usual, or there's major ups and downs compared to before the transit started. I have talked with some Scorpio rising clients who said the transit already started out for them with their partner kind of like coming out of left field going, I'm not happy with this, or, I want to do this, or maybe your partner wants to change their life in some respect and that affects yours. But, some people have already been kind of working that out and saying, I was kind of surprised at first, but now things are even better. So it can go that way too. It's not always, people get nervous sometimes when you talk about Uranus transits in the partnership house, but it's not always like your partner's going to suddenly up and leave you or something like that. It can be good surprises as well.
Right, definitely. Yeah, it'll depend on how your birth chart's set up and like what degrees especially are around 10 degrees of the fixed signs, if any.
Yeah.
This is a long-term, almost decade-long transit that's going to be going on through 2025, I think. That's when Uranus finally moves into Gemini.
Something like that, yeah.
Somewhere around the middle part of the decade, so there's still a long way to go. And for some of you, especially if your ascendant isn't until the later degrees of Scorpio, this may not be something that reaches the most critical or the sort of pivotal culminating point until later on during the course of that transit. It's more people that have their ascendant in like the first decan of Scorpio, the 1st through the 10th degree, that are going to get hit by it more this year, or where it's going to be more prominent. What's a better term to use
hit
for
by
hit?
It isn't really like a good way to talk about that.
Smacked by Uranus to get the light brush.
You're going to be gently awakened.
Gently caressed by Uranus.
Something like that.
I don't think that's what Uranus does.
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
No, it's more like shocking, unexpected things, and that really can be value neutral depending on the specifics and like how that plays out for you, depending on your own birth chart.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So that's really the main thing in August, and that's really right in the middle of the month. I mean, we of course have the backdrop of some of the other long-term transits that are still, it's not that those other transits aren't in effect.
Yeah.
It's just that we may not necessarily be in the most critical turning point of some of them until we move to the following month.
Right. Foreshadowing here.
And then we are.
Right.
So on the 9th of September, one of the more notable transits of the year happens, and this is Mars slows down and it stations retrograde at 28 degrees of Aries in the 6th house for those with Scorpio rising.
Yeah, so this is where some of those factors come into play that we were starting to talk about with the beginning of the transit at the end of June, once it entered Aries and into your sixth house. So it's been slowing down really since then. It's just been kind of like proceeding, but going slower and slower and slower until it finally stations September 9th to go retrograde. And so this is one of the major turning points if you're going to have major things with regard to either your workflow, what's on your work plate, or your health, or even just health routines that you need to kind of refigure. This is one of the two turning points around that process. And this is, when Mars is actually retrograde, when it stations to go retrograde, is typically the more frustrating part, because this is where if there's something that's going to crop up to frustrate whatever efforts you're trying to move forward with in this area of your life, and cause you to have to either go back over what you were just doing for the past couple months or retool something about that, this is when it will happen.
Yeah. And that's kind of emphasized, like those notions of Mars slowing down and stationing retrograde and getting diverted and like wanting to move forward, which is, of any of the planets, like Mars is the one that wants to press forward the most.
Mm-hmm.
And instead it's sort of frustrated by having to do a U-turn and go back and deal with something it had been through previously, which astronomically is literally retracing its steps and going backwards in the zodiac instead of forwards, but symbolically sometimes means slowing down and sticking with something or returning back to something that it had attempted to finish previously or thought it had finished.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of exacerbated in this instance because Mars is stationing at 28 degrees of Aries, and that's actually pretty closely within about 3 degrees square Saturn at 25 degrees of Capricorn in your third house. So that really just reemphasizes some of the frustrating, constraining type significations in terms of what's going on with Mars at this time, especially for people with placements in the later degrees of cardinal signs like 25, 26, 27, 28, 29 degrees of, let's say, Aries or Capricorn especially.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of, there's a lot of tension there and sort of like frustration between the sixth house of work and health and the third house of communication, siblings, and like movement or travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in one way or another, those two will kind of be at odds. Those two areas of your life will be temporarily at odds. And it's not to say that that has to be a forever thing, but yeah, temporarily you'll probably find that something about retracing your steps in the sixth house of work and health is somehow running into your long-term efforts in that third house. And this will probably be more frustrating feeling because they're both almost all the way through their signs when they retrograde. So Mars is like just had 2 degrees left before it was finished entirely with your sixth house. And similarly, Saturn, most of the way through Capricorn, and even having already gotten through all the degrees of Capricorn and then retrograded back. So I would say, yeah, I think we're in agreement that frustration is a really good keyword for this time period.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of some possible combinations of manifestations if it was a direct connection between the sixth and the third house instead of just something that's happening in parallel.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was a direct connection, it could be something like feeling frustrated about communication issues in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
So
For sure.
communication being a third house thing and the workplace being a sixth house thing.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there could be like problems in terms of movement or in terms of transportation, like having a Mars square Saturn between the third house of short distance travel, which indicates things like cars, and the sixth house, which can be the house of accidents. So being careful around this time, especially not to do anything impulsively, like, pull out in front of traffic or something potentially dangerous like that.
Definitely. I was thinking also things like, some sort of frustration with your ability to have transportation to work and that causing problems in the workplace. I know that's a pretty common thing.
Right. Like your car breaks down and you have to start taking the bus, but then it makes you late to work and creates tensions in the workplace or something like that.
Yeah.
Or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So those are different possible manifestations because like with all of these placements, we're dealing with broad archetypes that could manifest in a number of different and many different ways in terms of the specifics and in terms of the specific birth charts and the context of the individual lives involved.
Mm-hmm.
But here we're trying to dissect and get as close as we can to the individual manifestations by figuring what the core underlying archetype is.
Yeah, so it won't be those specific ones we just mentioned for everyone. It may be for some people, but there'll be other aspects of the 3rd and the 6th house that come out for the rest of the Scorpio risings.
Sure. So one of the things I like that's happening around this time that I think is helpful is that Jupiter stations direct in Capricorn, in early Capricorn, just a few days later. And I think that's going to help balance some things out in terms of the 3rd house, and in terms of the potential scenarios of like worst case scenario versus less worst case scenario. Jupiter, at least if there's problems, seems to have an antidote or a way to rectify some of the problems to some extent. And I think that's part of what it's doing by stationing direct there just a couple of days or a few days after Mars stations retrograde. So while there might be the introduction of a problem, there may also shortly after that be the introduction of a possible solution at the same time.
Definitely. Yeah, I could see that being something like, so your car breaks down, so you have all those tensions with getting to work late because you're taking the bus now, but then you talk to someone, maybe your sibling perhaps,
Right, like
since
a
it's in the
sibling
3rd
or like
house.
a neighbor or
Yeah.
or extended relative.
And they're like, oh, I have a car that I'm going to sell, but it'll be ready in like a month or 2 months or something like that. So it's like you have the hope introduced, but the problem isn't fully fixed yet.
Right. So that happens, the Jupiter station directing Capricorn, and then later in the month, Saturn stations direct in Capricorn for the final time. And this is the final pivotal turning point for Saturn's entire 3-year long, or I guess it's up to 2.5 years long transit through Capricorn at this point, where from this point forward, it's going to turn around and slowly start moving forward and beginning the final march towards the end of Capricorn and its entry into Aquarius in December. So this is truly the last leg of the journey. I'm trying to think of a famous journey. This is like Frodo in The Lord of the Rings has reached like Mount Doom and is ready to throw the ring into the volcano to destroy it. You're a big
I was going
Lord
to
of the
say,
Rings
so
fan?
that's not my reference point, but
Okay.
I always want to say, similarly, perhaps, that every time we talk about this final Saturn station in Capricorn, I always want us to play the final countdown song, which is like a cheesy 80s song.
Okay.
Like an 80s rock song.
I mean, you could sing it here
No,
just
I'm
to
good.
okay, just to refresh us.
But that's what it always makes me think of every time we talk about this, because this truly is like the final pivot point, the final major emphasis on this area in a Saturnian kind of way, before it's done.
Right. So wrapping up and cleaning up some things with respect to 3rd house topics of like siblings, of travel, of communication, maybe even education to some extent, or things surrounding like neighbors, your neighborhood, and other things in terms of a restructuring of that area of your life. And hopefully by the end of it, putting more firm foundations in that area that are a little bit more solid compared to when you first went into it.
Definitely. And if it's been a rough road, you can have hope that this is really the last kind of stationing emphasis, and stations always do emphasize whatever the planetary energy is. This is more of the like, this is a heavy area of my chart lately. This is the last emphasis like that, and before it leaves in December.
Yeah. So this is the final exclamation mark behind that transit, and then it's on its way out after this point. All right. So this is taking us into the last phase of what, quarter 3?
Yep.
All right. Or no,
Wait, no,
quarter
this
4.
is quarter 4. We're
All
actually
right.
in quarter 4.
It's late.
Yeah, we're a little tired.
Division capabilities are running a little low.
Yeah.
We're in the last phase of the year, and we're finally into quarter 4, starting with October.
Yes, the final countdown, as it were.
Okay. Which we're not going to sing. So October 4, one of the big things for me is that right in the middle of the month, we get the beginning of our 3rd and final Mercury retrograde of the year, which begins in Scorpio on the 13th of October. One of the things that is notable about this, aside from the fact that it stations retrograde in Scorpio, which is the rising sign, or the first house for those with Scorpio rising, the first whole sign house, is that it actually stations pretty closely opposite to Uranus. So I believe Mercury stations around 11 degrees of Scorpio, and it's opposite to Uranus around 9 degrees of Taurus. Let me put that up really quickly. So there we see Mercury moving into Scorpio, then it slows down and stations retrograde at 11 Scorpio, while Uranus is at 9 degrees of Taurus.
Yeah, that is pretty close. And while I normally don't focus a lot on Mercury retrogrades when we're looking at like a year-long period of time, that is, like you said, kind of more notable because it is in the first house for Scorpio rising. And so that's, given that it's stationing retrograde closely opposite the Uranus transit in your 7th house of partnership, it's almost something like a feeling of your sort of revisioning who you are as an individual and how that lines up or doesn't line up well with changing things with regard to your partnership, if you are in a partnership.
Yeah. And also potentially something about with Mercury stationing in the first, or even transiting the first, but especially stationed there, I think about finding one's voice and the process of finding one's voice, and sometimes that being a process where you have to go back and rethink like who you are and how you communicate with the world in general. But this either prompting or being prompted by some of the disruptions that are happening in the 7th house sphere of relationships coming from Uranus, or even perhaps in the process of sort of like finding your voice and rethinking who you are, that is in and of itself something that creates some tensions or some of the instability indicated by Uranus going through the 7th house.
Definitely. And oppositions are a natural tension. It doesn't have to be like the end of the world, but it is a natural tension because you're trying to work out like, who am I? What do I stand for? Even in kind of like a smaller revisiting way. That's just like a 3-week period and this longer, transitive change in partnership.
Yeah. So Mercury stations retrograde in Scorpio, but by the end of the month, it actually retrogrades back into Libra, into your 12th house. And then eventually it will station direct in the very beginning of November, on the 3rd of November, in the later degrees of Libra.
Yeah, it stations direct around 27, I think, because it's square transiting Saturn at that time.
All right.
In your 3rd house. So there's something about that, again, it's hard for me to speculate on Mercury retrogrades for everyone, even if it's the same rising sign. But whatever it is, something about your revisiting, something about the way you communicate or something like that is running into a similar, Mercury isn't the same as the 3rd house, but they do have one overlapping theme, which is communication. So, that could be an extra emphasis, when it's stationing direct on that issue in your life, how you communicate with other people, because they're both kind of indicating things about that.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it catches the very tail end of the Saturn transit, as you said, because Mercury stations direct at 25 Libra, squaring Saturn at 26 Capricorn. But it's taking place in the 12th house, which is kind of a tricky house because the 12th can have to do with things like enemies or people who you don't get along with very well in your life. It can also pertain to self-undoing or ways in which we undermine ourselves. So there could be some challenging themes here where there's kind of a balance because it's connecting the 1st house transit and the 12th house transit with finding one's voice at the beginning of it and revising the way that one communicates, but also being careful that one doesn't somehow undermine themselves or somehow create enemies as a result of communication with Mercury stationing direct in the 12th house. Although sometimes there's not a lot you can do about that. Sometimes just by speaking your mind and communicating the way that you naturally communicate, sometimes it will just naturally rub some people the wrong way. And that could be part of the issue with a little transit like that stationing in the 12th house square Saturn, is there may not necessarily be something you can do to fix that.
For sure. And for some people, it may be, some sort of blind spot, that they're speaking out of at that time, but or involving enemies. But for other people, given that most of the Mercury retrograde is in the 1st house of self, I almost wonder if that just dipping back a little bit into the 12th house and then stationing direct there, it might be for some Scorpio rising people, the 12th house can also be like things you weren't aware of, your own subconscious motivations, things like that, things that are skewing your perspective unnecessarily. And so certainly there's many other 12th house topics too, but that's one of them. And so, it might be something like, you suddenly become aware of, something that was skewing the way you were presenting yourself or what you were thinking about and, in kind of presenting yourself as an individual or how you were communicating with other people.
Yeah. I mean, Mercury retrogrades and 12th house transits are also very internal and very reflective.
Mm-hmm.
And with it squaring Saturn, it's almost like reflecting on some of the challenges that have happened over the past 2 or 3 years at the very tail end of that Saturn transit through the third house.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it has to do with like communicating some of the difficulties one that has gone through, or processing and reflecting on them as Mercury is going retrograde and stationing direct in the 12th house, and kind of channeling and reflecting on that Saturn square while we're basically in the very tail end, the last month of it.
Mm-hmm. That could be.
Okay. All right. So that is one of the signatures that's happening starting on the 13th of November and then ending in early December with the Mercury retrograde. It reaches its halfway point when Mercury conjoins the Sun on the 25th of October, since that's the Sun Mercury Cazimi. So whatever the issue is that's initially set up at the beginning of the retrograde starts to find some resolution, and you start to see the light at the end of the tunnel by that point. Not a lot of other major stuff happening in October, so we skip forward to November. Here, the major thing that happens is that Mars finally, after several weeks of being retrograde in Aries, it finally stations direct on the 13th of November in Aries at about 15 degrees of Aries, I believe.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is the turning point, the major turning point, I would say. We had the Mars station retrograde September 9th, and that kind of started that whole revisiting process of whatever was going on with regard to health or health routines or work or things with coworkers. And, that was probably a frustrating couple months, but now it's finally turning around. And so this is the other major turning point within that cycle. There was one in between in mid-October, the Sun-Mars opposition, but here Mars is finally going direct, and you can finally start straightening out and not quite moving forward quickly yet, because it's going to take a little bit of time to pick up speed. It won't go fast quickly, but you're finally on the right path. You're turning around, you're going direct again, and you're going to figure out and iron out anything that you had to go back over the last couple of months in that area.
Yeah, and from this point forward, while some of the irritation or the frustration may still be present, it's starting to look like there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and there will start to be, from this point forward, sort of a receding or a recession of some of that irritation as Mars just starts sort of casually coasting out of that sign instead of this long grind that it's been going through for several weeks up to that point, starting especially when it first stationed retrograde in September.
Yeah, so it may take some time, whatever the specifics are that you need to iron out, either because the logistics of it actually take time, or other people you're dealing with regard to that, on their end are going to take time, because this is square Saturn until they leave the signs. But, you're moving forward. You're finally moving forward. So this is a good turning point in mid-November.
Okay. I'm just glancing at the live chat, and we got a celebrity astrologer has joined us in the live chat. So Curtis Manwaring of Zodiac Soft Technology, he shares an anecdote. He says, back in the mid-90s, I had a client who had an auto accident on the way to seeing me. Mars was transiting the 6th house, was exactly square my natal Saturn in the 3rd. Some transits, he's saying, are experienced vicariously. So that's an interesting manifestation.
That is very interesting.
Right. Having the transit, but having it manifested in the life of like somebody around you. Which sometimes happens with the houses, especially when you involve like perfections and stuff, which can shift where the house significations, what they're manifesting relative to.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for sharing that. If anybody else has any anecdotes about transits that they've had, or especially some of the ones we're talking about with like Saturn transiting through the 3rd over the past couple of years, or any of those eclipses or anything like that, please let us know in the chat. Appreciate it.
And with this Mars transit going direct too, if any of you had that other manifestation of just kind of like losing energy for the last couple months, since Mars is so central to Scorpio rising, it being your ascendant and 6th house ruler, it'll probably start to come back at this point slowly, but it will still come back.
Right.
And I know that, I've seen that happen with some people before. Like they just become more exhausted during this transit, but then once it goes direct, things start getting better.
Right. Sort of like a return of vitality at that point.
Exactly.
All right. So that's the main thing that's happening in November. The only other major thing I wanted to mention is there is an eclipse. So at the very end of November, on November 30th, we enter abruptly back into eclipse season, starting with a lunar eclipse, which happens in Gemini in your 8th house of shared resources and mortality. So this is shining a spotlight on that area of your life and indicating a sort of culmination of events or an emphasis on that area. It's probably not something new, but instead something that was initiated 6 months earlier, sort of comes to a culmination or comes to fruition at this point in that area of your life.
Yeah, and this is also going to indicate an area of change for you over about the next year or so, because this is starting the eclipse season in full in terms of both of your financial houses. So the eclipses are going to be in your 8th house of shared finances here, and then they also happen in the opposing sign, Sagittarius, your 2nd house of your own income and possessions. So
yeah, and that solar eclipse is just 2 weeks later on the 14th of December.
Exactly.
So that's a good point that we're opening up a window, or some would say a portal. Some would say a portal in the 8th house, 2nd house financial access.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Some astrologers are not on board with this terminology of eclipses being portals.
Some might say that, some might not.
Okay.
Anyway, but yes, this is going to be an area of greater change over the next year or so for you in your financial areas. And that, that's going to be potentially, they go back and forth. So while the Gemini one at the end of November will technically be more focused on the shared resources or other people's money, can be like wills, assets, inheritance, different things like that, or things like mortgages or, taxes. Obviously, all of the financial topics kind of influence each other. And so while this first one is happening in that shared resources area, that may then bounce back and affect something about your own finances and vice versa.
Right. So my keyword for eclipses is that they're a time of great beginnings and great endings. So you're going to be seeing some great beginnings and some great endings in this area over the course of the next year or so as the eclipses bounce back and forth in these 6-month increments. So this is one of those time periods where you're going to see some endings taking place in the 8th house of like shared resources, other people's money, or even issues surrounding mortality are sometimes things that come up when the 8th house gets activated, especially by eclipses, which can involve different things. Sometimes it can be constructive, like deciding it's time to like write a will or realizing you've never done that or something like that. Other times it can be, important instances or actual like exposure to issues surrounding mortality more seriously.
For sure.
But yeah, ideas of great beginnings and great endings is the main keyword that really, I think, comes up at this point with eclipse season.
For sure. And especially if you're partnered, you can kind of easily see how these two houses affect each other, particularly with the Uranus transit going through the 7th. So an example might be, for instance, someone's partner suddenly gets like a way better job and therefore your partner's income rises. Well, that was a change for your partner. Then it changes your shared resources, and maybe that affects then how many hours you need to work at your job, which is your 2nd house of income, and vice versa. Maybe you get a new job and it's fabulous, and then that changes something about what you and your partner are able to do financially together in terms of your shared resources. So easily, if you are partnered personally, it can affect, those things.
Yeah, and I think it also might be connected with the very last major set of transits that come up this year in mid to late December, which is the great shift of the two largest planets in our solar system, which are Saturn and Jupiter. So this is the last major thing we have to talk about in this forecast, and it's actually potentially the biggest transit and the one that all the astrologers are talking about for 2020, which is that on the 17th of December, Saturn completes its almost exactly 3-year transit through Capricorn at this point, and it moves into Aquarius, where it's going to stay for the next couple of years. And then just 2 days later, Jupiter does the same thing, and it ingresses into Aquarius, completing its 1-year transit through Capricorn in your 3rd house, and it moves into Aquarius for the next 12 months or so, which is your 4th house of the home and family and living situation and parents and private life.
Mm-hmm.
So this is bringing a tremendous amount of activity and focus on the 4th house for, at the very least, the next year, as Jupiter and Saturn are transiting through that sign. And in the long term, Jupiter will leave after a year and go into Pisces, and Saturn will stay moving through Aquarius for the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So, and those two form actually a conjunction very soon after, which only happens once every 20 years, very shortly after they move into Aquarius.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's going to be a lot of focus on your 4th house of home, family, parents, that sort of thing. Now, for some people, that's going to be your actual, dwelling that you live in, your house, your apartment, whatever. That could potentially tie in those, shared resource topics, like if, say, you're buying a house for the first time or something like that. An eclipse in your shared resource area, or, which is the same house that governs like mortgages, loans and that sort of thing. And then, a lot more serious, responsible focus on the fourth house of home would make a lot of sense. Of course, that's only going to be true for some people, but that's one specific possibility. Other things, having to pay more attention to something with regard to your parents can be true if you're older in particular and your parents are older.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be something as well. Now, as we said earlier, in the spring, the spring of 2020, there was a Mars and Saturn ingress into the 4th. So that earlier ingress might have indicated something more of like a problem in your home and living situation or something with your family. But this, while it's still going to be Saturn coming back and forcing you to sort of take more responsible effort and attention to this area of your life, Jupiter's ingressing with it, which is a much different picture than Mars and Saturn. So this is more potential for opportunities or good things to come with this transit, even if you also need to kind of focus in a more serious fashion there.
Yeah, there's definitely more of a sense of optimism and growth, especially because earlier in the year, especially for the people with day charts, earlier in the year, that ingress of Mars simultaneously with Saturn was just kind of tense and kind of tumultuous for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, especially for the people with day charts, and to a lesser extent, the people with night charts, having Saturn and Jupiter move in at the same time does bring a bit of balance in terms of there being equal themes of both moving forward and like positive expansion, as well as some of the like themes of contraction and sort of like trying to double down and achieve stability.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So some themes of like gain as well as themes of loss, but there being more parity between them, so that there's both potentially some positive things and perhaps some challenging things happening, but that it's a little bit more manageable than it could be otherwise.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And it will be more noticeable as a positive opportunity for those born during the day that have Scorpio rising, but it'll still be a better situation than Mars and Saturn in there for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. Than just like Saturn moving through on its own, if it was a night chart without Jupiter.
Right, exactly. So, and even though Jupiter doesn't usually bring as big of opportunities for people born at night versus people born during the day, it usually still brings something, even if it's more modest. And so, that's much better than just Saturn there.
Sure. So, yeah, that's the last major change that happens. And I guess we've already talked about topics. I mean, it could be major stuff involving the parents and things that are happening in your parents' life, or in terms of your relationship with your parents. It could have to do with your home and your living situation and like what your living situation is, and major changes and restructuring when it comes to that. It could also have to do with your private life and whatever constitutes your private life, as opposed to the 10th house, which is more like your public life. But just some major developments of both expansion and contraction taking place starting in December of 2020, and then really lasting for pretty much the entirety of the following year.
For sure.
Which is starting to get us precariously close to getting into the forecast for 2021. But I don't know if you want to stick around for that.
I don't think we're going to do all of that tonight.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess we'll have to return again next year to talk about the forecast for Scorpio rising for 2021.
Sounds good. I'll pencil that in.
Okay, put it on your Google Calendar.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me for this. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
You've been in two forecasts? Three? This will be three. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm still making my way through my forecast for each rising sign. This was number 8. So I've just got a few more to go.
Yes. 2/3 of the way done, if I'm calculating right at this time of night.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody who's been cheering me on in the chat, both on Twitter and in the live stream. That's been amazing. So thank you very much. Thanks to Leisa. I'm just looking at some comments. We've got to do a few plugs before we wrap things up. So one of those things is that most of the artwork that we used for this episode comes from a set of posters that we just released over the past couple of weeks. And it's this package where it comes with 3 posters. And one of them is the planetary alignments poster that shows all of the ingresses of all of the planets and all the lunations and retrograde stations and major aspects and everything else in a single wall poster at a glance, so that you can sort of have or just look at your wall and see when all of the major transits that we just talked about in this episode will take place. We've also got the planetary movements poster that shows where the planets start at the beginning of the year and where they end up at the end, as well as a poster that shows the significations of the 12 houses, so you can know exactly what topics are getting activated when each of these planets move into different signs. So you can find out more information about that at the astrologypodcast.com/2020 posters. Additionally, Leisa and I just released a couple of weeks ago our annual 2020 Auspicious Elections Full Year Ahead Electional Report, where we actually sat down and we went through each of the next 12 months and we picked out one lucky day for launching different types of ventures or undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. And we're actually able to find some really good electional charts during the course of researching that report. And we put it out in a 2-hour recorded video just like this one.
Yeah, and we also have a whole written report that goes with it, so you can glance back at it during the year. Going through 2020 was kind of arduous, so we really want all of you to benefit from our efforts in, seeking through all of the challenging astrology to find the best possible dates and times to start new things, to have them go better than expected.
Right. So you can find out more information about that at chrisbrennanastrologer.com/2020 elections. And I'll put a link to this in the comments section below this video once we finish the live stream and the video recording is up. Other than that, we've got to give a shout out to all the patrons. There's a bunch of patrons who support the Astrology Podcast and pretty much are the only reason we're able to do marathon recording sessions like this, because there are people that are donating just like $1 each time we put out a new episode, or a variety of things. But basically without them, we wouldn't be able to do this. So in particular, I wanted to give a special shout out to patrons Christine Stone, Nate Craddock, and Tanner Robinson, as well as the Astro Gold Astrology app available at astrogold.io, the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org, and the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs at honeycomb.co. There's 2 major astrology conferences that are happening this year. The first is hosted by the International Society for Astrological Research, which is hosting a conference in Denver, Colorado from September 10th through the 14th of 2020. You can find out more information about that at esar2020.org. Additionally, the Northwest Astrological Conference is happening in Seattle from May 21st through the 25th, and that's something you can find out more information about at norwac.net. So if you'd like to become a patron of the podcast and get early access to new episodes, private episodes that are only available to patrons, and other bonus content, you can find out more information at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. All right, that is it for this forecast. Thanks again, Leisa, for joining me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
For helping me to navigate the Scorpio rising for 2020. I think we did a pretty comprehensive job.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how this all turns out for everyone.
Definitely. It should be an interesting year. May you live in interesting times.
Right.
All right. And thanks everybody for joining us in the live chat for this live stream. I appreciate it. Appreciate all your comments. Thank you. I'm going to take a little break and then decide if I'm going to try to do one more horoscope of Sagittarius, which I was going to try to do tonight, or if I'm going to put that off till tomorrow. But we'll see what happens. And I'll probably post an update on Twitter whenever I decide to start the next live stream.
Good.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. Good luck this year. Let us know how it goes. Please be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and post a comment below if you enjoyed this video or want to share something about transits that you've been experiencing so far this year. So good luck in 2020, and we will see you again next year for the forecast for 2021.
Thanks for listening. Have a great year.